Hi everyone and welcome to June's Bookorama. I'm June Thomas. I know that it's already the middle of February, but I still want to talk about the books I read in January because it was a fantastic reading month for me. Almost too good, if you know what I mean. Like, I started to wonder if the rest of the year would feel like a letdown. I'm glad to say that there have been some definite highlights so far in February, so I'm not too worried about that happening anymore. But I have to say, that is like a classic good problem to have, and proof that those of us who are predisposed to worry can worry about just about anything. I read 10 books in January, which is a lot for me. I am generally closer to 5 or 6, but what do you do when you finish a good book? Well, start another one, of course. Also, a whole bunch of books that I'd ordered from the library came ready all at once, so that was a motivation for getting on with things. I'll go through the books in the order that I read them. Because I often listen to audiobooks and books from Libby at that, I don't have physical copies of most of them, so I won't be juggling my January reads, but I'll put a photo of the covers somewhere alongside my head. So the first book I read in January was Kingmaker, Pamela Churchill Harriman's astonishing life of seduction, intrigue and power by Sonia Purnell. Here I should disclose that this book is published by my UK publisher, Virago, which kindly sent me a copy of this book. With that said, it is such a great read. Pamela Churchill Harriman was often described as a courtesan. She had a lot of affairs and marriages with a lot of powerful men, usually older men, and she was often dismissed because of that. But this book shows how hard she worked and how good she was at what she did. She married Winston Churchill's son Randolph, who was an absolute shit, and at the age of 20, she was, I guess you'd say, a valued sounding board for her father-in-law, who just happened to be the wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill eventually deployed Pamela as a secret weapon to persuade America to get involved in World War II. Pretty big deal. Nearly 50 years later, she was really involved in taking Bill Clinton from an ambitious but unpopular regional politician to the White House, which landed her in Paris as the US ambassador, where she worked hard and did good work. Between those two periods were decades of men and travel and glamour, a lot of bad relationships, and a very few good ones. Purnell does a great job of presenting Harriman's life in a sympathetic but not at all hagiographic way. It's great storytelling, amazing research, and also a reminder that the figure we sometimes see in movies, people who are in the middle of everything, really do exist in real life. They are rare, but charisma is real, and this book was just a spectacular work of nonfiction. I highly recommend it. Speaking of spectacular, the second book I read was Libertad by Bessie, Flores, Zaldìvar. I read this fueled by the kind of reading resolutions I often make at the beginning of the year and then forget about by February. I wanted to read more queer fiction and more books set in countries other than the UK or US, and I found myself with a YA novel set in Honduras. I don't really read YA, but if this is YA, then give me more. It was just an outstanding novel. And I guess it's YA because the main character is young. She turns 18 in the period that the book covers. That main character is called Libertad. She was given that name because she was born on her country's Independence Day. And while her burgeoning queer identity is indeed part of the story, it's just one of the many things that she is trying to figure out. It's a very political novel, one of the best I've ever read, in fact. The political background is the 2017 presidential election, which, spoiler alert, was wildly undemocratic, and her brother is very much involved in fighting for fair elections, as Libertad is in her own way through poetry. The book is really good at giving a sense of what life is like for lower middle class teens in Tegucigalpa, and a family life when parents and grandparents basically work 12-hour days to survive. And in an era when migration is a big topic, it was just fantastic about the forces that push people to leave places, even places that they really love. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Spring Ines Peña, and I really recommend it. One note, there is a lot of Spanish in this book. I speak Spanish, but I suspect that the energy of the narrator's performance, as well as context clues, mean that even if you didn't, you would know what was going on in those passages. It's really hard for me to imagine that Libertad won't be one of my top books of 2025. It was really great. The third book I read in January was Legacy of Spies by John le Carré, which is minor le Carré, but still worth reading. It's clearly from the end of his career because travel and what journalists call reporting was key to his writing process. He would travel and get material and put them in his books. The interiority of this book, much of it is a series of recollections from the past, shows he wasn't able to do that for this particular book, and it shows. It was entertaining, and I'm always glad to spend time with familiar characters like Peter Gwilym and all those old dudes from the classic Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy era, but just don't expect top-tier le Carré from this book. The fourth book I read last month was somewhat related. It was The Secret Heart, Le Carré and Me, Tales from a Secret Love Affair by Suleika Dawson. It is what the subtitle says, a memoir of an extramarital affair with a famous writer, one who was several decades older than the author, an element that actually was handled very nicely, I thought. Perhaps for obvious reasons, this book was published after le Carré and his second wife Jane had died, by which time the events were long in the past and many things in life had changed, including what it takes to have a cool life in London. Also, in the age of social media, the idea that a couple who were kind of cheating, who were, not a public couple, could go on holidays in Switzerland and Greece and other places where they could openly but still secretly go out and be a couple in public. I just don't think that would be possible these days for someone as famous as le Carré. We do learn that they had an amazing sex life. I wasn't in any way bothered by that, though it did start to feel a bit like, yeah, we get it. Dawson says they had a great relationship beyond the great sex, but David Cornwell, to use le Carré's real name, he comes across in the book as a controlling and condescending snob. It just wasn't clear to me why someone would want to maintain a relationship with this guy. Yeah. I do want to mention one part of the book that I found absolutely fascinating, and that is about audiobooks. Dawson worked at one of the earliest producers of audiobooks, and she met le Carré when he came into their London studio to record one of his books. In those days, audiobooks were books on tape, literally cassette tapes, and because those tapes ran at specific length, I believe she says they worked on C90 cassettes, books had to be abridged to fit into that time frame. That was Dawson's job, and having to jump in to adjust an abridgment, make it longer or shorter, when you hear the cadence of someone's reading, I mean, that was just such a fascinating glimpse of the early days of the audiobook format. Having recorded my own audiobook last year, I can say it is a lot more straightforward these days. Okay, number 5 was The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a collection of 3 essays from Coates' travels, one trip to Dakar, Senegal, one to South Carolina, and the section that has dominated coverage of the book, a visit to Israel and Palestine. One issue that I think is inevitable if you kind of read a lot of magazines and newspapers is that having been exposed to a lot of reviews and coverage when the book came out, there wasn't a lot left that felt fresh. It was almost as if I'd already read the book before I'd picked it up. That said, I found it very interesting. Coates is a great nonfiction writer, and I really enjoyed the passages where he talks about his own experience of writing and teaching writing. It is really fascinating to read his comparisons of his experience as a Black American with how he perceives the experiences of Palestinians and Africans. And it's just never a bad thing to spend time with Ta-Nehisi Coates and his writing. The 6th book I read in January was Agents of Influence, Britain's Secret Intelligence War Against the IRA by Erin Edwards. I apparently can't get enough of this topic. I read several books on the subject last year, and I'm currently in the last few pages of another. I find the troubles and how we are learning about what really happened in that period, how much violence, how many deaths could have been prevented but were allowed to occur in order to protect intelligence assets. That's a really interesting ethical question. And even decades after the shift from the Armalite to the ballot box and the embrace of the peace process, there are still many stories, a lot of history that hasn't been shared. Edwards is an academic, but he writes in a very accessible style. There are always agendas at play in books on topics where strong emotions are involved, and this is definitely one of those topics. But this book felt really authoritative and solid. Okay, number 7 was Great Expectations by Vinson Cunningham, which is just an outstanding novel. This book is great as a novel, as a work of fiction, but I think because I know Cunningham as a non-fiction writer, he's a staff writer at the New Yorker, at times I felt like I experienced it as a series of non-fiction vignettes. Scene pieces, I think they call them at the New Yorker. The book is about David Hammond, an extraordinarily perceptive black man in his early 20s who, having dropped out of college when he became a father, drifts into working on the presidential campaign of an unnamed charismatic black senator who bears a remarkable resemblance to Barack Obama. Cunningham worked on that campaign and later in Obama's administration. I was really happy to spend time with David, who had really smart things to say about a huge array of topics: art, music, the sociology and psychology of rich people giving money and support to a political candidate, and that feeling of interacting with people who you don't know, but kind of know because of their identity, whether that's rich, black, smart, calculating, ambitious, artistic, whatever. And of course, how they respond to you because of how they perceive your identity. It's beautifully written, really fascinating, great book. Book number 8 from January was one that I have with me, Outrage: Why the Fight for LGBTQ plus Equality is Not Yet Won and What We Can Do About It by Ellen Jones. I read this book so I could interview Ellen Jones for an event at Lighthouse Books in Edinburgh, and I'm really glad I did because it's an important, informative book. It's a great resource if you have someone in your life who wants to understand more about British queer life and issues. Just hand this to them and hope they read it. My penultimate read in January 2025 is another book I have with me. Book number 9 was also outstanding. It was The Shadow in the Garden, A Biographer's Tale by James Atlas. Personally, I am fascinated by the biographer's art, and Atlas is a very gifted writer, reader, and editor of biographies. This book is packed with really interesting stories from Atlas's experience, many of them extremely frustrating. Writing biographies of writers Delmo Schwartz and Saul Bellow, and from other writers' experiences of trying to paint a picture of someone's life, a stranger, someone outside your own body. I think biographers often think that if they share the making of the biographical sausage, so to speak, readers will be put off biographies, but I know that I am even more motivated to read them when I read about how they're made, as I am the work of the authors whose lives he tackled. The next book I'm going to read is Bellows Herzog, which I learned about from this amazing piece of nonfiction. Okay, the last book I read in the month of January was The Wizard of the Kremlin by Giuliano da Empoli, translated into English by Willard Wood. This is objectively a very good book. It is the story of the creation of contemporary Russia and its all-powerful leader. It's officially fiction, but there are many, many things in this book that really happened. It's a sort of fictional but very convincing explanation of factual events. It's very smart, very insightful, very well written and translated. But as you can maybe tell, I didn't really love it in spite of all those positive things. I think that is because it is cynical about pretty much everything except perhaps love. And cynicism is just not a particularly pleasant mode to linger in, but still, objectively, a good book. So, 10 books, 6 non-fiction, 4 novels, 6 by men, 3 by women, and 1 by an author who uses all pronouns. All good, many of them great. My God, what a start to the year. If you have any thoughts about these books, any books you think I should read, or indeed any questions about my book, A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture, please leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.